My name is Jim Creswell. I was born in Dalton, Nebraska, March 22nd, 1930.
March 22nd, 1930.
30.
What school did you go through?
I grew up in Southern California, Burbank High School, Nebraska, and my father was from Oklahoma. So as a child, we moved to Oklahoma until I was 9 years old, and then California.
When did you graduate the high school?
1948.
Around May, right?
June,
June.
I think.
Yeah. And then what were you doing?
I went to junior college. My father was an automobile dealer, and I grew up in the automobile business. But I went to junior college for 2 years and was drafted out of junior college. So I didn't get to complete it until I got home.
What is the college name?
Glendale Community College, Glendale, California.
And what did you study?
Business and pre-law.
How did you like it?
Well, I liked it. A lot of studying. I was not the best student in the country. In fact, my father's attorney told me I couldn't be an attorney because I couldn't study long enough to learn the procedures. So I think I would have been a good lawyer if I stuck with it, but...
So you were in the college when the Korean War broke out?
Yes.
Do you remember when you first heard about it?
No, I sure don't remember first hearing about it. I had broken my leg in 1950, right at the time the war started. And I was in a cast, and I decided to try to join the Army Air Force, Army Air Corps in those days. And they told me to come back when my leg healed up. Well, while I'm waiting for my leg to heal up, I got drafted into the Army in January of 1951. Right after it started, I didn't know where Korea was, of course, but I don't remember the exact moment that I was made aware of it, but I knew it had started, and people were talking about it, and so...
What did people talk about Korea?
That was a long time ago. I can't remember. There is a war going on in Korea, a startup of a conflict in Korea, and none of us knew where Korea was. Really was not all that interested in it at the time. Not thinking that we'd be involved in it. But it didn't take long for us to realize that some of my older friends were getting drafted and going into the service. I don't know of any of them that went into Korea. Out of my high school, one day there were 25 of us that went into the Army at the same day. That was the largest group.
Wow.
That we all went in at one time.
You mean Burbank High School?
Burbank High School.
25 of them a day?
25 of us in one day, yeah.
What did these students, your friends, were saying about Korea, being drafted to and dragged into the Korea?
We didn't have any idea what we were getting into. I had grown up through World War II. I knew what war was, but we didn't know anything about Korea. Apparently some people thought it was going to just be a small conflict. In fact, the organization I was with in Korea was the only one in Korea at the time the war started. A group called Korean Military Advisory Group. They were in Seoul, and when the North Koreans came across, I thought it was just going to be a little skirmish for 2 or 3 days. And they didn't get all that excited about it until a little later. But we didn't know about it. In Burbank anyway, and as a teenager, I really didn't care, didn't know.
So, where did you go for basic military training?
I went to Camp Roberts, California. It's in kind of the central part of California.
And what kind of training did you receive?
My regular basic training. I qualified for Officers Candidate School, OCS, and I said, that's fine, but they said, well, you're a draftee, so you'll have to sign up for 1 more year. Well, I didn't want to stay in the Army, so I said, I won't sign up for 10 more minutes. So they said, well, you're going to be a rifleman then. And I said, well, I'm not going to sign up for another year. So then they started offering me classes, schools, to keep from being in the infantry. Cook and baker school, I said, no thanks. They were going to teach me how to climb telephone poles. I said, no thanks. A couple others I can't remember. One of them was radio. And I said, is that radio mechanic, radio repair? I thought I could learn a career.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't even know. He said radio. I said, and he was twisting my arm to keep me out of the infantry. And I said, well, son, put me on for radio then. Assuming it was radio repair. It turned out to be radio operator.
So they didn't have any idea about what you
The
going to...
officer didn't have any idea what, they just said radio school.
How was the basic military training? Did you learn enough about radio operation?
Well, after I got out of basic training, I had 6 weeks of radio operation. And we learned Morse code. We had to learn 18 words a minute in Morse, sending and receiving Morse code.
So you know the Morse code?
Not anymore. I know SOS. That's about all I know. But I did know it. But it's interesting, backtracking a little bit, my sister was with the FBI. And her boss found out I was going in the Army. So being our background had been top security clearance, he said, let's get your brother into Counterintelligence Corps, CIC in those days. I guess it's CIA now. So he contacted me, and I met with him a couple of times. He said, you cannot tell anyone what's going on. We don't want the Army to know that we want you into CIC. Apparently they wanted me kind of undercover. And so I went on with my basic training in the radio school, and got out of radio school and found out we were going to Korea. So I called the FBI in Los Angeles and said, hey, I got my orders to go to Korea. What are you going to do about it? He said, well, we haven't asked the Army to cooperate with us, so we can't ask them to pull your file now. They want to know what all is going on. We'll see what we can do. Just go on to Korea and call us when you get home. Well, I got to Korea, and 35 of us in my radio class were in Yokohama.
Well, when did you leave for Korea?
Sometime in May. I don't know exactly what day.
1951.
51.
Where did you depart from?
We got from San Francisco. We got to Yokohama. In Yokohama, we went to Sasebo, Japan, to ship over to Busan.
How long did you stay in Japan?
Just 2 or 3 days. Just long enough to be assigned to different outfits.
And then, so it must be in May that you arrived in Busan. Okay. How was Busan at the time that you arrived?
Busan, it was really sad. There were millions of people in Busan. People living in riverbeds. I saw people freezing to death in doorways, children running around half naked. Terrible experience in Busan, because everybody had been pushed down to Busan. And they had no money, no food, it was very, very traumatic experience.
You saw that, you experienced that.
Yeah, I was actually in Busan. They kept me there for a couple of months to operate a huge Army radio. I and another kid were assigned to get this radio going to communicate with Seoul and with the islands, Hawaii. And so they kept us there for about 2 months. Then we had a lot of free time. And we'd go downtown Busan. But it was so sad, so devastating to me to see people like that. I remember seeing people frozen to death in doorways. No place to sleep, no place. Very, very sad, very traumatic.
And then what happened to you?
Well, after a couple of months in Busan, The other two, Seoul and Hawaii, couldn't get their radios operating, so they told us to forget about it. And I was already assigned to a unit called KMAG.
KMAG?
Korean Military Advisory Group.
Uh-huh.
And at that time, Busan was their headquarters. They later moved to Daegu. But they moved me from there to, they kept me in Busan for another month or two. And then we moved over to the west coast of Korea, southwest corner of Korea, an area called Songjongni, or Gwangju.
Gwangju.
Gwangju, and Songjongni was a railroad station next to it.
Uh-huh.
And that had been a big Japanese base at one time. And it was a training area for South Korean troops.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was basically our headquarters. There were probably 15 of us there working with the South Korean Army. And they were training them. We were just advisors. And they would get a group of soldiers together, a battalion of them, and go to the line with them. And there were 3 of us that were assigned to each battalion to go up to the front line with them and stay with them for 2 or 3 weeks to see how they fought, how they held out. Then we'd go back, get another one, stay down there in Gwangju for 3 or 4 months, go back, take another group up, back and forth. So fortunately for me, I got to travel a lot of South Korea and see from coast to coast and on the 38th on back.
What was it like to be there in 1951? What is the scenes that you saw?
Well, everything was pretty well blown up. Trees were all dead, all dying, bridges were blown up. It could have been a beautiful country. And I went back years later, and it is a beautiful country, but at that time, there was not much beauty. Like I say, everybody was in Busan, and the Busan perimeter area. No bridges, buildings devastated. But later on, 20 years later, 30 years later, I went back, and it's beautiful.
What was your mission? What was your main work? And describe the typical day of your service.
Well, typical day, I was working with about 3 or 4 Korean majors and colonels. And I was kind of not their right arm, and they didn't take orders from me, but I advised them on different things.
Example?
Well, a lot of it was Signal Corps advice, because I'd had the Signal Corps training. But I had also had a leadership course in the Army,
Mm-hmm.
and a combat course. So I worked with a friend of mine. We worked with a tank battalion. We taught them how to drive tanks. Taught them artillery. We had some howitzers there. We taught a little bit of everything. And then we, like I said, we'd go with them and see how they functioned in combat. And Gwangju was the center of, as that magazine article I gave you, the center of guerrilla activities. So we went out on guerrilla battles all the time. When we weren't working with the troops in camp, we were out hunting down guerrillas. And that was, we found out later that, well, they knew about it in 51 when that magazine was written. That was guerrilla territory. And that's why it's a Korea Eisenhower would never see, because they're too dangerous. And as Korean advisors, we found out that we had a reward out for us, dead or alive, because we were doing so much good for the South Korean soldiers, that the North Korean and Chinese wanted us out of the way. So we didn't wear any insignias, any logos or anything to identify us as being a target for them. But it was very dangerous. We went nowhere without a weapon in our hand. We didn't go to the kitchen, to the canteen. Didn't go to the bathroom without a rifle in our hand. And just slept with it. slept with a rifle on our chest.
Mm-hmm.
Because we never knew any minute we could be ambushed.
So you were involved in the guerrilla clearance, right?
A lot of guerrilla warfare, yes.
And how dangerous was it? Really?
Well, it's pretty dangerous because when our army cut the troops off, the North Korean and Chinese troops off, they ran down in the Pusan perimeter and they cut them off at the Incheon. They left thousands and thousands of North Koreans and Chinese down there, so they all banded together.
Chinese too?
Oh, sure.
Oh.
Sure. They were banded together, and then they were stranded. They couldn't get back to their homeland. So they banded together. We went out. We got word one time that a band of them was going. There was a prison camp not too far from us. They were going to go release the prisoners in that prison camp and then come over to our camp. So we went out and intercepted them. I say we, I and 3 other Americans and about 25 or 30 South Korean soldiers. And we captured these guerrillas heading towards us.
Uh-huh.
And the officer in charge, he said, well, we've captured these people. We know they're guerrillas. We have no room for them. So they shot them all right there in the rice paddy. They found out that the leader was a Chinese general and his wife. And the general was some like 25 or 26 years old, but he was a Chinese general.
Mm.
And we found out that their headquarters was in a village across the road from our camp,
Mm-hmm.
which made it a little hairy. They shot all of the guerrillas, the general and his wife. They knelt them down and chopped their heads off.
Who did it?
Right in front of us.
Who did it?
South Korean troops.
Uh-huh.
They put those heads in a box, took them to the village, headquarters of the guerrillas, and made every villager go past that box and see those 2 heads in the box with the understanding, this is what will happen to you if you are a guerrilla, if you are an enemy. You're going to lose your head. So that was kind of my first experience with fighting, I guess. We had some small arms fire from time to time. That was my first big encounter. And another time we got a notice that the train in Songjeongni, had been to Songjeongni, it was our supply train, was coming to Songjeongni, and it had been held up about 20 miles out of Songjeongni. The guerrillas had dynamited the track. A civilian train with 4 or 5 of our guys on it, and one supply car. They dynamited the track, all the people got off, and the guerrillas machine gun and mortared over 400 of them. And that made the news here in town, here in the United States. And we went up there and had to battle them for a day and a half while they collected all of these bodies. So that was over 400 that was there. And I had told my mother I was in a safe place, not to worry. But she read about that in the newspaper. I told her about the little villages around us, so they made a liar out of me.
So your mom knew about that from the article?
I had that article, that magazine article, and the article in the newspaper. It made the headlines. It was the largest massacre, I think, of civilians in one area, and that was sometime in '52, I guess.
Mm. So your mom was really worried about you?
She didn't show it, but I know she did, yes.
Did you write letter
I wrote
back
letters
to
quite
her?
often, yes.
Do you still keep that letter?
I have. She kept them, yeah, and I think I have them now. She passed away a few years ago. I think I have a whole shoebox full of letters that I have written. We got to numbering the letters because the mail was really bad, so you write a letter, you wrote number 1, and the next letter she get might be number 3 or 4. Well, 2 and 3 were following up. So she numbered her letters and I numbered mine when we mailed them. This is number 10, number 11. And of course over there we could not get any stamps. So like in World War II, we just wrote free on our envelope in place of a stamp. know whether you knew that or not, just right free on
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. You said that you still keep their letters.
Yeah.
Could you send that to me so that I can
A
scan?
whole shoebox, and I've got them stored away somewhere on
It's
it.
important for young children to know about how was it, from your letter, to exchange the letter between you and your mom and so on. So if you can please find it and
I
share
wrote
it.
letters telling that the children were naked, starving to death,
Oh,
living in straw shacks. I told pretty much like it was because it broke my heart. It really upset me.
pretty much you stayed in Songjamni the whole time?
Well, that was our headquarters, but
Yeah.
then our headquarters moved from Busan to Daegu. But I went from Songjongni up to the line several times with battalions.
Why?
Well, there were 3 of us with each 1,000 Koreans to see how they were fighting,
Uh-huh.
to see what they had learned.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a very dangerous role because they didn't look out after us; they were looking out after themselves.
Mm-hmm.
There was a flank. There was a front line of 1,000 troops, 1,000 Koreans. There was one of us on one end and one on the other end and one in the middle, and we kept in touch with walkie-talkie radios. And many times we had to run for our life because the South Koreans at first, in the middle of the night, with what the term was called bug out. They would just leave and leave the flanks open, maybe a British flank here, an American flank here, and a hole here where the North Koreans could come right on in. And they didn't tell us when they did it. I woke up twice hearing strange voices, and it was Chinese voices, and I grabbed my rifle in my sleeping bag and headed south.
So you saying that South Korean army's soldiers just left without any notifying Americans?
Yeah, yeah.
That's bad.
It was the very beginning. They were scared. They weren't trained. I contacted a general, American general. I don't know who he was, but they would take they would take men off the line, American men or British men off of the line, and give them some rest and relaxation back miles behind. I suggested to this general that you put him right behind my battalion. So we had American on one side, British or Greek or French on one side, and the troops behind us so that the South Koreans could not bug out. And that saved our lives a couple of times, I'm sure.
What was your rank?
Well, that's interesting. It's hard to believe. I went in, I made PFC, private first class. I was working with majors and colonels. So the general and the colonel in charge of my outfit gave me what they call a field promotion of major,
Yeah.
so that these majors would identify with my major logo. They would respect my rank rather than the one stripe on my arm. So they took the stripe off my arm and put a major's shield on my major's leaf on my.
What do you mean? You promoted from PFC to major?
A major, and I got paid for it.
How did it happen?
Well, that's it. They had to because there was nobody between me and them. The majors were all. Our majors were all busy. There were very few non-commissioned officers in my group. Now, when I got out of the Army, I got busted back down to PFC. So I didn't retire as a major. But my rank was major in Korea. So it was a temporary major, temporary rank. Pretty rare, I think. In fact, I don't know if anybody else had ever.
So how much were you paid from?
For
how much were you paid when you were PFC?
Well, I don't remember, but when you went in as a recruit, we got $21 a month. Then we got to Korea, we got overseas pay, we got combat pay. Probably went up to $50 a month. I don't remember. That was 60 years ago.
And then?
And then as a major, it went up to probably $200. But I sent all that money home. I couldn't spend it. I think it was all I think it was all sent automatically home. Because I couldn't spend it. There was no place to spend it, anything.
How was the living condition in Songjongni? You were in the tent or in
We
the
were in
building?
tents. We were in tents to start with. Then they built some Quonset huts for us. And an interesting story about the Quonset hut. We had one Quonset hut that was our kitchen and our dining room.
Huh.
And it was not insulated, and Quonset huts are cold in the wintertime, freezing cold. Well, the Chinese were not too far ahead of us. They had some Quonset huts, and we could see them.
What do you mean in Songjongni?
North of Zhongjiang, the guerrillas had some Quonset huts.
Really?
And where they got them, I don't know. But we could see them with our binoculars, and they had an insulation and paneling. So I and another...
Better than yours.
Oh yeah, a lot warmer than ours. So I and another kid went over and stole a truckload of those one night.
You stole it.
Stole it. In those days, you could take a wire and hot wire a car very easily. So I had a piece of wire and a screwdriver, and we went over and stole this Nissan truck, Japanese truck, full of insulation and paneling, and brought it down, and the engineers paneled our Quonset hut. Well, Christmas Eve of '51, we got to bed, and that night, the guerrillas came over and set fire to the Quonset hut and burned it up. So they got even with us.
You sure about this?
Yeah, I did it, yeah. And the mess sergeant was sleeping up in a loft up in the Quonset hut, and he had a lot of ammunition and hand grenades, and they kept going off, and so we couldn't even get close enough to it to try to put the fire out. Because it had been that camp we were in had been a Japanese camp. It had been a prison camp, actually. It was on a hill, and underneath the hill was a large cavern that they could hide several airplanes. Well, down in the bottom of this hill, down in a cave, was a dungeon. And the dungeon had concrete floors, it had iron bars, like a prison. And the Japanese apparently kept prisoners down there. And that's where we kept all of our ordnance, all of our weapons, all of our guns, and not our guns, but our ammunition and hand grenades and shells, because it was very cold down there and cool. But it had been a Japanese camp. Now, Songjongni, I understand now, is a college town, beautiful college town.
When did you leave Korea?
Well, I got on the ship in Sasebo the 25th of December of 52. So I left
December 25th?
It's Christmas Day, we got on the ship.
From Sasebo?
From Sasebo.
1952?
52.
And left for state?
Left for the state. Took us 14 days to get to San Francisco.
What did people say about your service when you got back?
Oh, they were just happy to see me, basically. And I was happy to get home. We didn't talk about much about it.
Why did not?
Well, I guess this other gentleman you were interviewing talked about the post-traumatic stress.
Mm-hmm.
I apparently had that, but I didn't realize what it was. One time I watched a movie, a real good movie called Bridges of Tokari, Korean story. This pilot got shot down, and Mickey Rooney was flying a helicopter to recover him. And they were in a ditch, an irrigation ditch. Well, I saw that movie, and that night I went to bed. I was a single parent for 18 years. I had 2 daughters. And that next morning, I woke up, I was tired, and my oldest daughter said, "Daddy, who were you hollering at last night?" I said, "I wasn't hollering at anybody." "Well, you were making a lot of noise." Well, my bed was a mess. And I had realized that I had been in that same kind of an irrigation ditch with the guerrillas chasing me. And it brought back all of that, relived it. And so I guess I had that PTSD, whatever it's called.
PTSD.
And another time, years later, in San Diego, California, a commercial airplane, a PSA commercial plane and a small plane collided in midair over a residential district of San Diego. This was in the 60s. And they talked about bodies being hung up in trees and parts of bodies in the trees. Well, I got sick. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I didn't know what was wrong with me. Then I realized after seeing these 400 bodies and going through them looking for my buddies, this mention of this other bodies brought back all of this memory. So I guess I had it, probably still have it. I slept, when I came home I had to sleep on the floor. I couldn't sleep in a bed, the bed was too soft. I had to sleep on the floor.
When did you go back to Korea?
I went back and I break out of the Daegu perimeter because they had a celebration in Daegu for us. 2000. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. The trees had all grown back. The buildings. This gentleman said he had pictures of Seoul, or he was in Seoul. There's nobody in Seoul. I have a picture of Seoul with nobody in it.
Why you didn't bring any pictures?
Well, that's in my collection. That's just all buried. I have pictures of Seoul without a soul in it. Now there's 11 million people living there. We crossed the Naktong River when I first went up there. Across a pontoon bridge. Now there's 4 or 5 bridges across there. Not the Naktong River. The Naktong River is down south. We crossed it 4 times. We would one time we had to deliver a message from Busan up to close to Daegu when the fighting was still going on up there. A buddy and I in a Jeep, and it was raining, and it was about 50 miles, 25 or 30 miles each way, 50-mile round trip, I think. And we would have to stop and see a red flag on the hillside. That meant guerrilla activities. We'd stop and wait till the white flag went up. We'd go a little further, red flag, white flag, red flag, white flag. It took us 13 hours to cover 100 miles, 50 miles up and 50 miles back.
Do you have any message to our young generation?
Well, yes, I don't think they will listen. The younger generation is so involved in electronics that they're not associating with their parents or with other children on a game-like situation. They're all playing with their iPads or all of their electronic gear. We used to play kick the can in the streets. We used to play football and baseball and all kinds of things just around the neighborhood.
But now they're just texting?
They're so busy with the electronics that they don't even know what we're talking about. So that's kind of sad, but that's a generation, that's a couple of generations from beyond mine. So, and talk about war, they don't know anything about war. They know Afghanistan and that area, but it's all the news, and they see it on the news, but they don't have any association with it unless they have a relative that was involved in it, and then they get a little closer. But they're so caught up in their own growth that they're not interested.
Thank you very much for your fight. Because of your sacrifice, Korea is now what it is, and we all thank you, and the Korean War has never been forgotten in the minds of Koreans.
That's for sure.